The air in New York's most exclusive restaurant, Aurelia, was usually thick with the scent of money and truffle oil. But tonight it was choked with fear, because Damien Al-Jamil had arrived. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a titan, a predator who moved through the world as if he owned it, leaving a wake of crushed competitors and broken men. Every captain of industry, every senator, every person of influence in that room either worked for him, owed him, or feared him. His power was absolute, his temper legendary. And in that gilded court of ambition, a young waitress named Clara Evans, invisible to men like him, was about to do the unthinkable. She was about to make the lion look like a fool. The whisper started at the valet stand and slithered through the restaurant like a cold draft. He's here. It didn't need a name. There was only one he who could silence the clatter of silver on porcelain and replace the confident hum of power with the taut silence of apprehension. Damien Al-Jamil did not walk into a room. He conquered it. He was a man sculpted from harsh desert winds and hardened by the cold steel of Wall Street. Though he carried a Western name, his lineage traced back to the formidable merchant princes of the Old World, a fact he wielded with the same precision as his vast fortune. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit, the color of a midnight sky, and his eyes, dark and piercing, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a hawk that saw the field, the rabbit, and the rabbit's final terrified heartbeat all at once. Tonight he was dining with Senator Marcus Thorne, a man who was publicly a pillar of democracy but privately a puppet whose strings were pulled tight in Damien's fist. They were seated at table 1, the restaurant's throne, a semicircular booth of plush crimson leather that offered a panoramic view of the dining room and, more importantly, ensured everyone in the dining room had a view of them. Frank Marino, the restaurant manager, personally oversaw the service. His usual boisterous Italian charm had evaporated, replaced by a sheen of nervous sweat on his brow. The 1982 Petrus chilled to exactly 65 degrees. Mr. Al-Jamil. Frank said, his voice a little too high. And the beluga caviar, of course. Damien didn't even look at him. He waved a dismissive hand, his attention fixed on the senator. The votes are secured, Marcus. Don't bore me with the details. Just ensure the Commerce Committee understands that my logistics division requires deregulation, complete deregulation. Damien, some of the environmental reports are, the senator began, his voice weak. Are irrelevant. Damien finished, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. The air temperature around the table seemed to drop with it. The Earth has been here for billions of years. My port expansion project will be finished in 3. The planet will survive. He finally turned his gaze on Frank. Is there a problem with the service tonight, Frank? You seem to be hovering. No, sir. Not at all, Mr. Al-Jamil. My apologies. Frank practically scurried away, his face pale. From across the room near the service station where she was polishing wine glasses, Clara Evans watched the scene unfold. She was 24, a student at the Pratt Institute, working at Aurelia 3 nights a week to pay for her art history degree and the rent on her tiny Brooklyn apartment. To Damien Al-Jamil, she was less than a ghost, a functional cog in the machine that served him. But Clara was an observer. It was the core of her nature as an artist. She didn't just see people. She saw the posture beneath the suit, the flicker of fear behind the smile, the subtle tells of a lie. She saw the way Senator Thorne's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. She saw the way Frank, a man who usually commanded his restaurant with the authority of a general, seemed to shrink by 6 inches in Damien's presence. She had seen this performance before. Damien Al-Jamil was a regular, and his visits were like royal inspections. He would find a flaw, a wine served a degree too warm, a steak cooked medium instead of the medium rare he'd ordered, a perceived slight from a staff member, and he would exploit it. Not with shouting, which would be too common, but with a cold, surgical precision that left his victim utterly dismantled. He'd once had a sommelier fired on the spot for recommending a wine he deemed pedestrian. The man, a renowned expert named Charles, had simply vanished from the New York culinary scene afterward. Damien's power extended far beyond the walls of Aurelia. "Clara, table 1 needs their water refilled," whispered Maria, another waitress, her eyes wide with anxiety. "I don't want to go over there. The last time he said my perfume was an assault on his senses. I wasn't wearing any." Clara nodded, her expression calm. "I'll take it." She wasn't brave, not in the traditional sense. She was terrified of him just like everyone else, but her fear was overshadowed by a deep, simmering resentment for the kind of casual cruelty he embodied. Her world was one of passion for history and beauty, of struggling to create something meaningful. His was a world of demolition, of treating people like disposable assets. As she approached the table with a pitcher of chilled water, her movements were fluid and professional, a mask of calm she had perfected. She moved to the senator's side first, refilling his glass without a sound. Then she moved to Damien's. He was in the middle of a monologue, gesturing with a hand that wore a Patek Philippe watch, worth more than her entire college tuition. "Authenticity, you see, Marcus. That is the only currency with any real value. Anyone can buy a copy. Anyone can buy a business. But to possess something truly singular, something with a history that cannot be replicated, that is true power." He paused, taking a sip of the Petrus. He didn't acknowledge Clara's presence as she refilled his glass, but his eyes flickered towards her for a fraction of a second. It was a look of utter indifference, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture. As she turned to leave, his voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the air. "Waitress." Clara stopped her back to him. Her heart began to pound, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned slowly. "Sir." His eyes roamed over her, not with interest, but with critical assessment, as if looking for a flaw in a product. "Your name?" "Clara, sir." "Clara," he repeated, letting the name hang in the air, as if tasting it for imperfections. "Your posture is adequate. You move quietly. This is good. It shows you understand your function." It wasn't a compliment. It was a classification. She was a tool performing its function correctly. Clara simply nodded, her jaw tight. "Thank you, sir." "Do not thank me," he said, his voice turning cold. "Thank your manager for training you properly. Competence is expected, not praised. You may go." Clara walked away, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel every eye in the restaurant on her, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. She returned to her station, her face a neutral mask, but inside a storm was gathering. She had seen true masterpieces in museums, paintings filled with the soul and struggle of the artist. She had studied the lives of men and women who created legacies of beauty and thought. And then there was Damien Al-Jamil, a man who spoke of authenticity, but was, to her discerning eye, the most hollow man she had ever seen. He collected things, but he understood nothing. And it was that hollowness, that fraudulent claim to a world he only owned, but could never truly appreciate, that would soon become his undoing. An hour later, The main courses had been served and cleared. The atmosphere at table 1 had shifted. The business talk was over, and Damien had moved on to his favorite topic himself and the magnificent tapestry of his acquisitions. He was holding court, his voice now imbued with a performative passion designed to awe the senator and anyone else within earshot. The subject was his latest prize, a painting he was in the final stages of acquiring through a private auction. It was The Last Voyage of the Albatross, a long-lost masterpiece by the 19th century maritime painter Julian Croft. The art world was buzzing about its resurfacing after nearly a century in a sealed Swiss vault. Croft was a master of light, but not in the way of Turner. Damien pontificated, swirling a post-dinner brandy in a large snifter. Turner's light was divine chaotic. Croft's, his was a light of grim reality. It was the cold, unforgiving light of the North Atlantic, the kind that reflects off icebergs just before they tear a hole in a ship's hull. Senator Thorne nodded along his expression, one of rapt attention, though it was clear he knew nothing about art. Incredible Damien. Truly. The Albatross is his magnum opus. Damien continued, his voice resonating with an owner's pride. It depicts the final moments of the eponymous ship caught in a tempest. But the genius is in the detail. Everyone focuses on the storm, the waves like jagged mountains. But they miss the key. In the lower left corner, almost hidden in the sea foam, Croft painted a small, discarded doll floating in the water. It's a symbol of the innocence lost to the merciless ambition of the sea. It is that single, heart-breaking detail that elevates it from a mere painting to a profound statement on man's futility. He leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips. The so-called experts at Sotheby's and Christie's, they all missed it in their initial analyses. I was the one who spotted it from the digital prospectus. It's what convinced me I had to have it. An eye for detail. Marcus is everything. At her station, Clara froze. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The glass she was polishing stopped midway through its rotation. A doll in the lower left corner. Her mind raced. She had just written a 15-page paper on Julian Croft for her Masters of 19th Century Realism seminar. Croft was her obsession. She knew his catalogue raisonné by heart. She had spent weeks analysing his brushwork, his thematic obsessions, his subtle signatures. The Last Voyage of the Albatross was famous precisely because its history was so mysterious, but its composition was known through preliminary sketches and a single grainy photograph from a 1928 exhibition catalogue. And Clara knew, with the kind of unshakable certainty that comes from hundreds of hours of dedicated study, that there was no doll. Croft's symbolism was never so literal, so much sentimental. His work was about the brutal, unsentimental power of nature. He painted ropes, broken masts, and the cold, indifferent sea. The heartbreaking detail in The Last Voyage, according to the leading Croft scholar, Professor Alistair Finch, was far more subtle. It was a single seabird, an albatross flying away from the sinking ship, not towards it, symbolizing nature, abandoning man to his fate. The bird was in the upper right corner, often mistaken for a simple brushstroke against the dark clouds. Damien al-Jamil was wrong. And not just wrong, but confidently, arrogantly wrong. He hadn't discovered a hidden detail. He had invented one. He had concocted a story to make himself sound more perceptive, more brilliant than the experts, to bolster his narrative of being the man who sees what others miss. Clara's blood ran cold, then hot. It was one thing for him to be cruel to the staff. It was another for him to desecrate the work of an artist she revered, to twist its meaning to serve his own bloated ego. It was a lie wrapped in a veneer of culture, a forgery of intellectualism. She looked over at table 1. Damien was laughing now, accepting the senator's fawning praise. He looked invincible, a king on his throne, dispensing what he believed to be wisdom. To challenge him would be professional suicide. Frank would fire her on the spot, and Damien would likely ensure she never worked in a service job in New York again. It could even affect her standing at Pratt if he decided to extend his influence there. A man like him surely had a name on a building or two. Her mind was a battlefield. One voice, the voice of survival, screamed at her to stay quiet, to let it go. It wasn't her business. She was just a waitress. Her opinion was worthless here. But another voice, the voice of the art historian, the voice that believed in truth and beauty and the integrity of an artist's vision, whispered back. He is lying. He is defiling Croft's legacy for his own vanity. And no one in this room has the knowledge or the courage to stop him. She thought of Julian Croft, a man who died penniless and obscure, who poured his entire soul onto his canvases, seeking only to capture a harsh and beautiful truth. And now, over a century later, this barbarian was using his masterpiece as a prop in his personal theater of power. Maria bumped her shoulder gently. "You okay, Clara?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Clara looked from Maria's worried face to Damien's triumphant one. In that moment, a quiet, steely resolve settled in her chest. It wasn't about being brave. It was about respect. Respect for her studies, for her passion for the dead artist who couldn't defend himself. She placed the wine glass down on the polished counter with a soft, definitive click. She straightened her apron, took a deep breath, and began to walk towards table 1. She had no plan, no grand strategy. She only had the truth, and she was about to find out if that was enough. As Clara approached the table, the world seemed to slow down. The ambient chatter of the restaurant faded into a dull roar, and the light seemed to converge on the crimson booth where the lion held court. Frank caught her eye from across the room, his expression a frantic mask of horror and confusion, silently pleading with her to turn back. But Clara's gaze was fixed on Damien Al-Jamil. She stopped, not beside him, but a respectful few feet from the edge of the table, ensuring she wasn't looming. She waited for a pause in the conversation, a small pocket of silence she could step into without being overtly disruptive. The moment came when Damien took another sip of his brandy. "Excuse me, Mr. Al-Jamil," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the air with surprising authority. Damien lowered his glass, his eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. He didn't look at her, but at Senator Thorne, as if to say, "Can you believe the audacity? I did not summon you," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I know, sir. I apologize for the interruption." Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the point of no return. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary on Julian Croft's The Last Voyage of the Albatross. I am a great admirer of his work." A flicker of surprise registered on Damien's face. He seemed momentarily intrigued by the novelty of it, like a king finding a talking mouse. "Is that so?" he said, a condescending smirk touching his lips. "And what does a waitress know of Julian Croft? I'm studying his work at the Pratt Institute," Clara stated, simply refusing to be baited. "My thesis is on the symbolic use of fauna in his later period." The senator shifted uncomfortably. This was not part of the script. How fascinating, Damien said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Do you have a point, or are you just seeking a commendation on your extracurricular activities? I have a point, sir, Clara said, meeting his gaze directly now. The full force of his intimidating presence washed over her, but she held her ground. You mentioned a detail in the painting, a doll in the lower left corner symbolizing lost innocence. I did, Damien said, his eyes narrowing. A detail that escaped the so-called experts, a testament to a keen eye. He was daring her, practically begging her to contradict him so he could crush her. I'm afraid there might be some mistake, sir, Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly level and respectful. All existing scholarship, including Croft's own preliminary sketches held at the National Maritime Museum, indicates that the key symbolic detail in that painting is not a doll. The silence at the table was now absolute. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed to have ceased. Senator Thorne looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Damien placed his brandy snifter down on the table with a loud, deliberate thud. The smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. A mistake, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Are you a part-time waitress, standing here and telling me that I am mistaken? I am saying that the historical record and the artist's known thematic tendencies do not support the presence of a doll, Clara clarified, choosing her words with surgical precision. The detail scholars have long identified as Croft's statement on futility, as you so eloquently put it, is the lone albatross in the upper right corner flying away from the wreck. It signifies nature's indifference, a theme consistent throughout his oeuvre. A doll would be uncharacteristically sentimental for Croft. Every word was a hammer blow to Damien's carefully constructed facade. She wasn't just saying he was wrong. She was explaining why he was wrong, using the language of art history, a language he had only pretended to speak. She was exposing him as a fraud in the very arena he had chosen for his display of superiority. For a moment, Damien al-Jamil looked utterly stunned. His air of invincibility evaporated, replaced by the raw, naked shock of a man who had never been challenged, let alone corrected, especially not by someone he considered less than human. Then the shock curdled into rage, a deep, venomous rage that made his face pale and his knuckles white as he gripped the table. "You are insolent!" He hissed the words, tight and controlled, yet more menacing than any shout. "You think your little night school class gives you the right to question me?" "It's not about my rights," Clara replied, her own fear now replaced by a strange sense of calm. She had spoken the truth, and the consequences no longer mattered as much as that fact. "It's about the artist's work, the truth of the painting." "The truth?" Damien laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Let me teach you a lesson about the truth, little girl. The truth is what I say it is. The truth is that I am in the process of paying $30 million for that canvas. When it is in my possession, if I say it has a dancing monkey in the corner, then it will have a dancing monkey. Its story will be the one I choose to tell." He stood up, his tall frame looming over her. "And you have just told your last story in this establishment. You're fired." He turned his venomous gaze on Frank, who was now rushing towards the table, his face ashen. "Frank, get this thing out of my sight, and have her final paycheck delivered to my office. I will personally deduct the cost of my ruined evening from it." Frank grabbed Clara's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Miss Evans, come with me. Now." He was pulling her away, trying to de-escalate to save his restaurant. But Clara had one last shot to fire. She looked past Frank directly at Damien Al-Jamil. "You can buy the canvas, sir," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent restaurant. "But you can't buy the truth of what it is. And a lie, no matter how much you pay for it, is always ultimately ridiculous." The word hung in the air. Ridiculous. It was the perfect word. It didn't just label him a liar. It labeled him a fool, a rich, powerful, but ultimately ridiculous man, playing dress-up as a connoisseur. The blood drained from Damien's face, then returned in a furious, mottled flush. He looked for the first time not like a lion, but like a bully on a playground who had just been publicly shamed. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had been so thoroughly dismantled, his intellectual authority so completely undermined, that his usual weapons of wealth and intimidation were useless. Senator Thorne stared down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the porcelain. Everyone in the restaurant was frozen, watching the unbelievable spectacle. As Frank finally managed to hustle Clara towards the kitchen doors, a new sound entered the room. It was a soft chuckle. A low, appreciative laugh came from a corner table where a quiet, elderly gentleman named Mr. Arthur Peterson had been dining alone, watching the entire exchange with keen, intelligent eyes. The laugh, though quiet, was a spark in the powder keg of Damien Al-Jamil's humiliation. It was the sound of his authority not just being challenged, but being mocked. And in that moment, the feared Damien Al-Jamil looked utterly, completely, and undeniably ridiculous. The kitchen doors swung shut behind them, and the hushed drama of the dining room was replaced by the chaotic symphony of a busy restaurant kitchen. The clatter of pans, the hiss of the grill, and the shouts of chefs seemed a world away from the icy confrontation that had just occurred. Frank let go of Clara's arm, his face a jumble of fury, fear, and a sliver of disbelief. "What in God's name were you thinking, Clara?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "Do you have any idea who that is? That's not just a rich customer. That's Damien Al-Jamil. He could buy this building and have it torn down for a parking lot by tomorrow morning if he felt like it." "He was lying, Frank," Clara said, her own adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a shaky emptiness in its wake. "I don't care if he said the sky was green with purple polka dots," Frank exclaimed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You work here. Your job is to pour water, take orders, and smile. Your job is not to give art history lectures to men who could end your career with a single phone call. You're fired. I have no choice. You have to go. Now." Clara nodded slowly. She had known this was the inevitable outcome. "I understand." She turned and walked to the staff locker room, her legs feeling like lead. The other waitstaff averted their eyes, whispering amongst themselves. She was no longer one of them. She was a cautionary tale. She quickly changed out of her uniform and into her street clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater. As she gathered her belongings, the weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. She hadn't just lost a job. She had provoked a monster. Frank's words echoed in her mind. What if Damien didn't stop at just getting her fired? She walked out the back alley entrance, the cold night air a shock to her system. The city lights of New York seemed to mock her, a glittering paradise she had just been exiled from. She had stood up for her principles, but what good were principles if she couldn't pay her rent or afford her tuition? Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. "Miss Evans." The voice was calm and cultured, and it came from the shadows of the alley. Clara jumped, spinning around to see the elderly gentleman from the corner table. It was Mr. Peterson, the man who had laughed. He was impeccably dressed in an old but well-maintained tweed jacket and held a classic wooden cane, though he didn't seem to need it for support. His eyes behind thick-lensed glasses were bright, with an intelligence that reminded her of one of her favorite professors. "Mr. Peterson," she said, surprised. He was a quiet regular, always reading a book, always polite. He seemed so out of place in this grimy alley. "Arthur, please," he said with a small, wry smile. "I wanted to offer you my compliments. What you did there. I haven't seen anything that brave in a very, very long time." "Brave or stupid," Clara muttered, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "I just lost my job." "You did more than that," Arthur Peterson said, his smile fading into a more serious expression. "You exposed Damien Al-Jamil for what he is, a hollow man, a fraud, and you did it publicly. He will never forgive you for that." This wasn't comforting. "Thank you for the vote of confidence," she said wryly. "It wasn't meant to be," he replied. "It was a warning. I know him, you see. Better than most. I know what he is capable of." Clara looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. There was a deep-seated weariness in his face, a history of pain behind the sharp eyes. "How do you know him?" Arthur Peterson sighed, tapping his cane softly on the broken pavement. "My family used to own a publishing house, Peterson and Sons. We specialized in academic texts, art history books, poetry. It was my grandfather's legacy. We weren't a massive conglomerate, but we were respected. We published the first definitive guide to Julian Croft's work, In Fact, Alistair Finch's seminal text." Clara's eyes widened. "I've read it. It's the Bible for Croft scholars." "It was," Arthur said with a sad smile. 5 years ago, Al-Jamil decided he wanted to enter the media world. He staged a hostile takeover of Peterson and Sons. He didn't want our legacy or our authors. He wanted our real estate in Midtown and our distribution network. He bought the company, gutted it, sold off the assets, and fired everyone. My family's work of 3 generations erased in less than 6 months. He called it streamlining for the new media landscape. I called it vandalism. The pieces clicked into place for Clara. Mr. Peterson wasn't just a spectator. He was a casualty. His quiet dinners at Aurelia, a restaurant frequented by his destroyer, suddenly seemed less like a coincidence and more like a vigil. "I'm so sorry," she said the words, feeling inadequate. "Don't be," he said, his gaze hardening. "Be prepared. He won't be content with you losing your job. The humiliation you dealt him tonight was profound. He will see it as a debt, and his debts are always paid with interest. He will try to ruin you, Miss Evans. He'll look into your school, your finances, your family. He will find a pressure point and squeeze until you break." A wave of real fear, colder and deeper than any she had felt before, washed over Clara. This was no longer about a lost job. This was about her entire life. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur Peterson looked up and down the dark alley, then back at her. A new light had entered his eyes, not just intelligence, but the glint of a long-dormant fighting spirit. "For 5 years I have watched that man operate with impunity," he said, his voice low and intense. "I have been a ghost, a relic of a company he devoured. But tonight you reminded me that even the most formidable predator can be made to look foolish. You found a chink in his armor. Not his finances, not his political connections, but his ego, his fraudulent intellectualism." He stepped closer, his expression resolute. "You cannot fight him on his terms. You don't have the money or the power. But you have something he doesn't: authenticity, the very thing he pretends to value. You have the truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple business card. It was old and elegant, with embossed lettering, Arthur Peterson, Peterson & Sons Publishing. The name was definitely uncrossed out. "He thinks this is over," Arthur said. "He thinks you are a fly he has swatted. He will move to acquire his painting, to erase tonight's embarrassment with the sheer force of his wealth. But we are not going to let him. You and I, Miss Evans, are going to give Mr. Al-Jamil a proper lesson in art history. We are going to take your truth and turn it into a weapon he never sees coming." Clara looked down at the card in her hand, then backed up at the determined old man. An hour ago she was a waitress. Now she was unemployed, a target, and an ally. She was terrified, but for the first time since she had walked away from that table, she wasn't alone. "Okay, Arthur," she said, her voice finding its strength again. "What do we do first?" Damien. Al-Jamil was not a man who tolerated humiliation. He processed it, converted it into a cold, hard fuel for revenge, and then executed that revenge with the methodical brutality of a state-sponsored demolition. The laughter of Arthur Peterson had been the spark, but Clara's final word, ridiculous, was the inferno that now burned within him. The morning after the incident at Aurelia, the siege began. It was not a physical siege with battering rams, but a modern corporate one, far more insidious and devastating. The first salvo was aimed at the restaurant itself. By 9:00 a.m., Frank Marino received a call from the holding company that owned the building on Park Avenue. Their largest shareholder, a previously anonymous offshore entity, had been bought out overnight. The new majority owner was a company named Jamil Global Holdings. An emergency board meeting was called. The agenda a review of the lease agreement with a tenant named Aurelia, which was reportedly suffering from a decline in service standards. Frank felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Damien wasn't just tearing down the parking lot. He was buying the whole street to do it. The second salvo was a targeted media strike. By lunchtime, a notorious gossip columnist for the New York Post, a man well known for being on Damien's payroll, published a blind item: which high-end eatery is letting its unhinged staff accost and insult its most valued patrons. Seems one waitress with delusions of grandeur decided to trade her tip tray for a soapbox, leading to a shocking display that has the city's elite thinking twice about their reservations. It was vague, but for those in the know, the message was clear. Aurelia was toxic. Bookings for the following weeks began to be cancelled in droves, but the most personal and terrifying assault was reserved for Clara. When she met Arthur at a small anonymous coffee shop in the village that afternoon, her face was pale and her hands trembled as she held her phone. "He found me," she whispered, her voice strained. "I got an email this morning from the Dean of Students at Pratt. It was very formal. It said an anonymous complaint had been lodged against me regarding a potential violation of the Student Code of Conduct outside of university grounds. It says there's going to be an inquiry into whether my public behavior has brought the institution into disrepute." Arthur's face grew grim. An anonymous complaint from a man who is likely one of their most generous benefactors. The Al-Jamil wing of the architecture school, perhaps. Clara nodded numbly. It was dedicated 2 years ago. I didn't make the connection. They're putting my scholarship under review pending the outcome of the inquiry. My scholarship, Arthur. Without it I can't. She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "He's cutting you off at the knees," Arthur said, his voice tight with anger. He's not just taking your job, he's taking your future. This is his way. He isolates his targets, severs their lifelines, and watches them wither. Clara felt a rising tide of panic. This was happening too fast. His power was immense, his reach seemingly infinite. He was a leviathan, and she was in a rowboat, frantically paddling against the tide he created. What do we do? How can we fight this? He owns everything. Not everything, Arthur said, his calm a stark contrast to her panic. He took a sip of his tea, his eyes thoughtful. He doesn't own the past. He doesn't own the truth. Right now, he is reacting with pure wounded pride. He's using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. But his focus is still on the prize that caused all this trouble, the painting. He slid a copy of an Art World journal across the table. The headline read, "Al-Jamil nears acquisition of lost Croft masterpiece." The private auction, hosted by a boutique firm named Elysian Heritage Auctions, was set for the end of the week. "This is his next move," Arthur explained. "He will publicly purchase the last voyage of the Albatross for a record-breaking sum. He will then magnanimously loan it to a museum, perhaps the Met. And when the museum displays it, the plaque will read, 'On loan from the collection of Damien Al-Jamil,' and the description will of course mention the profound, previously undiscovered detail of the floating doll. He will literally rewrite art history to erase his humiliation. He will make his lie the official truth, and your correction will be forgotten, dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled waitress." Clara stared at the magazine, at the smirking photo of Damien Al-Jamil beside the article. He was creating his own reality, and he had the money to force everyone else to live in it. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. "So we can't let him get the painting," Clara said, a new resolve hardening her voice. "Bidding against him is impossible," Arthur countered. "He'd pay $1 billion for it, just to prove a point. No, we cannot stop the sale. But we can change the story." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You said yourself, a doll is uncharacteristically sentimental for Croft. It's a clumsy, obvious piece of symbolism. Why did Al-Jamil invent that specific lie? Why not something more plausible, a hidden signature, a face in the clouds? Why a doll?" Clara frowned, considering it for the first time. "I don't know, it's amateurish. It's the kind of detail someone with no real understanding of art would think is profound." "Exactly," Arthur said, his eyes gleaming. "It's a mistake, an unforced error, and in my experience men like Damien Al-Jamil don't make mistakes without a reason. Their ego is usually too polished. This lie feels personal. It came from somewhere deep inside him. It wasn't just a random boast. It was a story he needed to tell." A new path forward began to illuminate in Clara's mind, pushing back the shadows of fear. They couldn't fight his money or his influence. The siege was unwinnable on his terms. But they could become detectives. They could investigate the lie itself. "So we don't focus on Damien," Clara said, thinking aloud. "We focus on the painting, and we focus on the doll. We need to find out everything we can about the last voyage, its history, its ownership, its journey through the last century." "Precisely," Arthur affirmed. "His power is in the present. He controls the media, the markets, the politicians. But the past is a foreign country, and its borders are not so easily controlled. We need to find something in the painting's history that contradicts his narrative in a way he cannot bury." The siege was on. Damien was bombarding them with all the power of his modern empire. But Clara and Arthur were preparing a counterattack, not with weapons of wealth, but with dusty books, forgotten archives, and the unshakable conviction that somewhere hidden in the long and silent history of a single painting lay a truth that could bring a giant to his knees. Their investigation had begun. The next few days were a blur of frantic clandestine research. While Damien's lawyers were tightening the screws on Pratt and finalizing the paperwork to evict Aurelia Clara, and Arthur established a makeshift headquarters in the back room of Arthur's dusty, book-filled apartment on the Upper West Side. It was a war room papered not with battle plans, but with photocopied auction records, museum catalogues, and timelines scribbled on a large whiteboard. They operated on the assumption that Damien's lie about the doll was not random. It was a psychological fingerprint left at the scene of the crime. Their mission was to uncover the origin of that fingerprint. Their first breakthrough came from the archives of Peterson & Sons Publishing. Arthur still had copies of nearly every book his family had ever printed. In a long-forgotten crate, they found the original research files for Professor Finch's book on Julian Croft, including correspondence from the 1970s. "Listen to this," Arthur said, reading from a fragile typewritten letter. It was from a retired art restorer in Liverpool who had claimed his grandfather worked as a dockhand for the shipping company that first owned the painting in the 1890s. He writes, "My grandfather always told a story about the big Croft painting. Said the shipping magnate who commissioned it, a Mr. Blackwood, hated the final piece. I called it morbid, but Blackwood's young daughter Elara adored it. She would sit in front of it for hours. Grandad said she even gave the ship a little toy to keep it company on its sad voyage." Clara looked up from her laptop, her eyes wide. "A toy?" "He doesn't say what kind of toy." "No, just a little toy," Arthur said, his excitement palpable. "But the name, Elara, it's an old name. Almost like Clara." He gave her a meaningful look. The connection was tenuous, a ghost of a whisper across a century. But it was the first time anything resembling a child's plaything had been associated with the painting. Still, it wasn't a doll painted onto the canvas. It was something external, a child's game. Their next step was tracing the painting's provenance, its chain of ownership. After the Blackwood family's shipping empire went bankrupt in the early 20th century, their assets were liquidated. The last voyage of the Albatross was sold in a chaotic estate auction in 1928. This was where the official record, the one Damien and the auction house relied on, got murky. The painting was listed as sold to a private European collector and then vanished into a Swiss vault, only to reappear now. "The auction records from that time are a mess," Clara said, scrolling through digitized pages of a yellowed 1928 ledger. "Most sales are just listed with a surname, Smith Dubois Cohen. It could be anyone. Damien's people will have done their due diligence, but only as far as they needed to establish a clear title for the sale," Arthur reasoned. "They wouldn't dig for stories. They'd only dig for legal ownership. We need to dig for the human element." For 2 days, they cross-referenced the surnames from the auction ledger with immigration records, ship passenger lists, and census data from the period. It was a painstaking needle-in-a-haystack search. Clara's art history training had made her a meticulous researcher, able to spend hours sifting through dry data for a single, shining detail. Late on the third night, fueled by stale coffee and sheer determination, she found it. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fatigue and excitement. "Come look at this." On the screen was a passenger manifest for the SS Majestic, which sailed from Southampton to New York in April 1929. One name on the third-class passenger list stood out: Jamil Elias, Under occupation, it listed carpenter. He was traveling with his wife and their young son. Jamil. Arthur breathed, leaning closer. It could be a coincidence. Maybe, Clara said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. But the ledger from the Blackwood auction, there's a sale entry for a large, unnamed maritime painting to a buyer listed only as Jamil. The price was £50, a huge sum for a carpenter, but not an impossible one if it was his life savings. A carpenter from Lebanon buying a massive oil painting of a sinking British ship, Arthur mused. It makes no sense as an art investment. It must have been for personal reasons. Clara's mind was racing, connecting the dots. What if Elias Jamil was one of the thousands of migrant workers who passed through Liverpool's docks? What if he worked there just like the art restorer's grandfather? What if he saw the painting, heard the stories about the little girl, Elara, who loved it? They kept digging now with a name and a new direction. They scoured New York City archives. They found Elias Jamil in the 1930 census, living in a crowded tenement on the Lower East Side. He worked as a cabinet maker, a skilled tradesman. But then tragedy. His wife died in 1932. Elias struggled as a single father during the Great Depression. The records showed he sold off possessions to make ends meet. In 1934, there was a pawn shop record for the sale of one large painting in ornate frame for the pitiful sum of $20. The buyer was a minor art dealer who a few years later sold his entire collection to a Swiss financier. That was how it ended up in the vault. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that made Clara's blood run cold, came from a small digitized newspaper clipping from a local community paper in 1934. It was a brief human interest story about the struggles of immigrants during the Depression. It featured a short interview with Elias Jamil. Clara read the key passage aloud, her voice trembling. "It is hard," the carpenter Mr. Jamil said through a translator. "I must sell everything, even the picture. My son, he cries. He loves the picture of the big ship. When he was a baby, his mother made him a small rag doll. He would hold the doll up to the glass and say, 'Don't be scared. She will ride the waves with you.'" The article ended there. Silence descended on the small room, thick and heavy with the weight of history. There it was, the Achilles heel, the origin of the lie. The doll wasn't in the painting. The doll was in the story, a family story, a story of poverty loss and a father's love. Damien al-Jamil hadn't invented the detail out of thin air. He had dredged it up from a memory he had likely suppressed for his entire life. He wasn't the descendant of Arab merchant princes. He was the grandson of Elias Jamil, a poor carpenter from the Lower East Side. The painting wasn't just a status symbol. It was the last remnant of a past he had spent his entire fortune trying to erase. His desperate attempt to reclaim it wasn't about art. It was about his own history. But in his arrogance, he had conflated a treasured family memory with the physical reality of the canvas. He had projected his own childhood onto the painting and in his hubris declared his personal story to be a universal hidden truth of the artwork. "My God," Arthur whispered, sinking into a chair. "He's not just a liar. He's a man at war with himself. He despises his own humble origins so much that he's created this entire fantasy of being old money, of being a connoisseur by birthright. Buying this painting is his way of finally conquering his own past, of owning the story, instead of being owned by it." Clara looked at the whiteboard at the timeline of a family's struggle. The siege suddenly felt different. They weren't just fighting a corporate titan. They were fighting a man's deepest, most painful secret. "The auction is tomorrow," Clara said. "He's going to buy it, and he's going to cement his lie into history." "Perhaps," Arthur said, a slow, strategic smile spreading across his face. "But a story can be a powerful weapon, and we now have the true one. He wants to be the one who tells the painting's story fine. Let's give him the stage, and then let's give him the ending he never saw coming." The Elysian Heritage Auction was meant to be Damian Al-Jamil's coronation. Held in a private salon at the Pierre Hotel, the room was a fortress of quiet money. At the front, the last voyage of the Albatross rested under a perfect spotlight, its dark, churning waves waiting for their new owner. Damien sat in the front row, holding paddle number 1. His victory was a foregone conclusion. The bidding was a brief formality. As the price climbed past 20 million other collectors, demurred, unwilling to challenge a man, bidding with the full force of his ego. 30 million. Damien stated his voice calm and clear, not even bothering to wait for the auctioneer. It was a declaration, not a bid. Silence. "Sold," the auctioneer announced to Mr. Damian Al-Jamil. Polite applause followed. Damien gave a regal nod as reporters invited by his own team swarmed him. This was the moment. He'd engineered the moment to cement his lie into history. "Mr. Al-Jamil, what does this masterpiece mean to you?" a reporter from the Wall Street Journal asked. "It represents the triumph of a discerning eye." Damien began, his voice smooth as silk. "For decades, its deepest secret went unnoticed. Experts saw only a storm. But I saw its heart, a small detail of a child's doll lost in the waves, a profound symbol of—" "Excuse me." The voice, clear and steady, cut through the salon. The crowd turned. Standing at the back of the room were Clara Evans and Arthur Peterson. They hadn't been invited, but they were here. Damien's face froze, his triumph instantly souring into cold fury. "Security," he snapped. "Remove them." "We just came to congratulate you, Damien," Arthur called out, his voice surprisingly strong. "And to thank you. Your interest in the painting inspired us to uncover its true story. It's a wonderful American immigrant story." The reporters, sensing a far better headline, pivoted their cameras and microphones, swinging toward Clara and Arthur. The security guards paused, caught in the middle. Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on Damien. "The painting wasn't brought to this country by a wealthy collector," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of fact. "It was brought here in 1929 by a carpenter from Lebanon named Elias Jamil." A gasp went through the room. Damien's face went white. "He was your grandfather," Clara continued, pressing the truth into the silence. "He bought it with his life savings because his young son, your father, loved the painting. That little boy had a rag doll his mother made him, and he would hold it up to the glass. There is no doll in the painting, Mr. Al-Jamil. The doll was in your father's hand. It was a beautiful family memory that you twisted into a lie to build a false identity for yourself." She held up a folder. "We have it all. The ship's manifest with your grandfather's name. The pawn shop receipt from 1934, when he sold it for $20. The local newspaper article where he spoke of his son's love for the painting." She didn't yell. She simply presented the truth. In an instant, Damien's grand narrative shattered. The descendant of merchant princes was revealed to be the grandson of a poor carpenter. His $30 million purchase was no longer a trophy. It was a monument to his own shame. The titan of industry looked small, a man terrified of his own humble past. He didn't rage. He didn't speak. All the fight drained out of him. He stared at the painting of the storm-tossed ship, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, past the flashing cameras and shocked faces, a hollowed-out man finally conquered by the one thing he could never buy: the truth. The story of Damien al-Jamil's public unraveling became a legend in New York's elite circles. The lie was more damaging than any financial scandal could ever be. His carefully crafted aura of infallibility was gone, replaced by the pitying whispers about the man who was ashamed of his own grandfather. His empire didn't crumble overnight, but its foundation was cracked. Deals became harder, rivals grew bolder, and the fear he once commanded was replaced with a quiet, knowing contempt. Clara Evans, with Arthur Peterson's help, not only had her scholarship at Pratt reinstated, but was offered a full fellowship, funded by an anonymous donor, who many suspected was a rival of Damien's, delighted by his fall. Aurelia survived, with Frank Marino developing a newfound respect for his staff. The truth of the painting, the story of Elias Jamil, became its official history, a testament to an immigrant's dream. Clara showed the world that true power isn't measured in dollars or skyscrapers. It's found in the courage to speak the truth, the integrity to honor the past, and the simple fact that no lie, no matter how grand, can withstand the quiet force of one person who knows the real story. If you were moved by Clara's courage and the incredible power of the truth, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of the underdog taking on the giants. What did you think of Damien's downfall? Let us know in the comments below. We believe in the power of stories, and with your support, we can continue to bring them to you. Thank you for watching. He watched her from across the opulent dining room, a predator observing its prey. She was just a waitress, another face in the endless sea of people who served him. But tonight, something was different. Fueled by vintage scotch and the sycophantic laughter of his associates, a cruel idea sparked in his mind. He lifted his hand, beckoning her over. When she stood before his table, he didn't offer a compliment or another order. He pointed a platinum credit card at her, the gesture dripping with condescension, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'll pay you $10,000 to dance for us, right now. Prove you're more than just a tray carrier." The room fell silent. But Rhys Covington had miscalculated. He thought he was buying a moment of humiliation. He had no idea he was about to ignite a fire that would burn his entire world to the ground. Ethelred's was not a restaurant. It was a statement. Perched on the 65th floor of a skyscraper overlooking Central Park, its floor-to-ceiling windows framed a glittering panorama of New York City. The air inside was thick with the scent of money, a blend of expensive perfume-aged leather, and the subtle mouth-watering aroma of truffle oil. The clinking of Christofle silverware against Bernardeau porcelain was the room's delicate heartbeat. For the patrons, it was a sanctuary of power. For the staff, it was a battlefield of quiet servitude. Catalina Petrova knew this battlefield well. For 2 years, it had been her entire world. Each night, she donned the starched, unforgiving black uniform, pulled her cascade of honey-blonde hair into a severe bun, and schooled her face into a mask of polite neutrality. She moved with an economy of motion that bordered on art, her steps silent and swift, her hands steady as she poured a 1982 Chateau Margaux, or placed a plate of seared foie gras before men who wouldn't remember her name, let alone her face. Tonight, the prize jewel of Ethelred's clientele was holding court in the corner booth. Rhys Covington. The name was a headline, a brand, a force of nature. At 34, he was the CEO of Covington Global, a tech and private equity behemoth that devoured smaller companies like a shark. He was brutally handsome, with sharp, intelligent eyes, the color of slate, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a custom Tom Ford suit, as if it were a second skin, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming discreetly on his wrist. Catalina had served his table 3 times tonight. He hadn't looked at her once. He spoke in a low, confident rumble, his attention fixed on his 2 associates, Oliver Finch, and another man she didn't recognize. They were celebrating a hostile takeover, their laughter sharp and triumphant. Catalina refilled their water glasses, her presence as significant as a gust of air from the climate control system. The board folded like a cheap suit, Rhys was saying, a smirk playing on his lips. They talked about company culture and loyalty. Pathetic. Every person has a price, Oliver. You just have to find it. Oliver Finch, a man with a kinder face and weary eyes, shifted in his seat. Perhaps some things aren't for sale, Rhys. Rhys let out a short, derisive laugh. Name one. It was then that his gaze, sweeping the room with bored ownership, finally landed on Catalina as she cleared a nearby table. He watched her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. He saw the ramrod straight posture, the controlled grace in the way she bent to lift a heavy tray. To his cynical mind, it registered not as dignity, but as practiced subservience. A cruel, alcohol-fueled idea took root. He wanted to prove his point to Oliver, to the world. He lifted a manicured hand, a gesture both lazy and commanding. Waitress. Catalina's heart gave a little jump. Being singled out by a table like this was never good. She approached, her hands clasped behind her back. Yes, sir. Rhys didn't invite her closer. He made her stand at the edge of the booth, a supplicant. He leaned forward, his voice a low drawl that carried in the suddenly quieted atmosphere. He pulled out his wallet, a sleek piece of black alligator leather, and extracted a platinum card. He didn't offer it to her. He pointed it at her like a weapon. I have a proposition for you, he began, the smirk returning. His associates stilled, watching the unfolding spectacle. My associate here believes some people possess a dignity that can't be bought. I disagree. I say everyone has a price. He tapped the card on the table. I'll pay you $10,000, right here, right now. All you have to do is dance for us. Or a collective muffled gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Catalina felt a hot flush creep up her neck. This wasn't a request. It was a public dissection. He wanted to see her squirm, to see her grapple with her need versus her pride, and then inevitably capitulate. He wanted to prove that she, like the company he'd just acquired, was just another asset to be bought and controlled. Sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You heard me, he said louder now, enjoying the attention. Clear a little space. Dance. Any kind of dance. Entertain us. $10,000 for 5 minutes of your time. What do you say? Is your dignity worth more than that? Her manager, Mr. Henderson, was already moving towards them, his face a mask of panicked apology. This was a catastrophic breach of decorum. But Rhys Covington was not a man you interrupted. Catalina looked at Rhys's face. She saw the cold amusement in his eyes, the utter certainty that he had her pinned. He saw a waitress in a cheap uniform. He saw rent bills, student loans. He saw desperation. And he was right. She was desperate. But not for the reasons he imagined. She didn't think of her tiny shared apartment in Queens or her mountain of debt. She thought of her brother Nico. She thought of the sterile white walls of the hospital room, the quiet beep of the machines, the specialist's grave face as he discussed experimental treatments for systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis treatments, not covered by any insurance. $10,000 wasn't rent money. It was a single dose of medication. It was 2 months of physical therapy. It was a sliver of hope. Her pride, the shield she had carried for years, felt paper-thin. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. But surrender wasn't in her nature. A different kind of fire, one she had suppressed for so long it had nearly turned to ash, began to glow in her chest. She met his gaze, and for the first time her own eyes were not neutral. They were clear, direct, and held a depth of emotion that startled him. She gave a single sharp nod. Fine. The word hung in the air, electric. But not here. She added, her voice suddenly clear and steady. She gestured to the small empty space near the grand piano, where the pianist had just finished his set. There, and I'll need you to pay up front. Reese's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. He had won. He gestured to the waiter's station, and within a minute a portable credit card machine was on the table. He swiped his card, punched in the numbers, without looking, and a receipt for $10,000 spooled out. He tore it off and held it out to her. Your winnings, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Catalina took the slip of paper. Her hand did not shake. She folded it once and tucked it securely into her apron pocket. Then she turned her back on him and walked toward the piano. She began to unpin her hair. The severe bun unraveled, and a cascade of honey-blonde waves tumbled down her back, catching the light of the chandeliers. She kicked off her sensible black work shoes, her bare feet making soft contact with the polished marble floor. The room was utterly silent. Every diner, every waiter, every busboy was frozen watching. Reese Covington leaned back in his booth, crossing his arms. He was ready for the show. He expected a clumsy, awkward shuffle, a cringe-worthy attempt at seduction. He was about to get the shock of his life. Catalina stood in the small circle of light by the grand piano. The city lights of Manhattan blazed behind her, a silent, glittering audience. She closed her eyes for a single, centering breath. In that moment, she was no longer Catalina Petrova, the waitress. The starched uniform felt like a costume, and the opulent restaurant faded away, replaced by the scent of rosin and worn wooden floors of a studio she hadn't seen in 5 years. She could hear the voice of her old ballet master, Mikhail, a stern Russian émigré who saw the fire in her soul. Do not dance the steps, Catalina. He would say, his voice a gravelly rumble. Dance the story. Let it bleed from you. She opened her eyes. The story tonight was one of fury and grief. She began without music. The first movement was slow, almost hesitant. She raised her arms not in a graceful arc, but as if pushing against an immense weight. Her fingers trembled, then curled into fists. Her body contracted a silent scream of frustration that was so palpable, a woman at a nearby table put a hand to her own throat. Reese Covington's smirk faltered. This wasn't the awkward flailing he'd anticipated. This was something else. This was control. Every muscle in her body was taut, deliberate. Then she moved. It started in her feet. A complex, percussive rhythm tapped out on the marble, a staccato beat of anger. Her body followed, erupting from its coiled tension. She launched into a series of movements that were a breathtaking, impossible fusion of classical ballet and raw, contemporary expression. There was the perfect line of an arabesque, held for a heart-stopping second, immediately shattered by a guttural, angular contraction of her torso. She spun a flurry of fouette turns, executed with a precision that would have been applauded at the Lincoln Center, but they weren't clean and pretty. They were dizzying, desperate, as if she were trying to outrun a demon. The diners were mesmerized. Phones were forgotten. Conversations died. The only sound was the whisper of her bare feet on the floor and her own ragged breathing. Oliver Finch leaned toward Reese, his voice a stunned whisper. "Reese, who is she?" Reese didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on her. He, a man who curated his life with priceless art, who could distinguish a Monet from a Manet, at 20 paces recognized the language she was speaking. It was the language of true artistry, of a talent so profound it was almost violent. He felt a strange, unsettling feeling in his chest, the feeling of being utterly, catastrophically wrong. Catalina was lost in the dance. It was a torrent of everything she had suppressed for 5 years. The grief for her parents lost in a car crash that had also shattered her brother's body. The rage at the universe for stealing her dream, forcing her to trade her point shoes for a serving tray. The fierce, desperate love for Nico that fueled every grueling shift, every sacrifice. She danced the pain of watching her own muscles atrophy while her brother fought to regain the use of his. She danced the humiliation of begging doctors for payment plans. She danced the despair of lonely nights, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. Her movements were sharp, precise, filled with a sorrow that was achingly beautiful. A grand jeté was not a leap of joy, but a frantic, desperate reach for something just out of grasp. Her arms, which had carried trays of champagne, now carved through the air, telling a story of loss and resilience. For the finale, she slowed. She sank to the floor, her body folding in on itself until she was a crumpled heap on the marble. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. It wasn't acting. In that moment, the weight of it all came crashing down. Then slowly, painfully, she rose. One vertebra at a time, she unfurled her head, the last thing to lift. She stood tall, her back ramrod straight once more. Her face was tear-streaked, but her eyes blazed with defiance. It was a declaration. "You have not broken me." She held the final pose, chest heaving, her gaze sweeping over the stunned room until it landed directly on Reese Covington. The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched for 10-15 seconds. It was broken by a single person. Oliver Finch, his face etched with awe, began to clap. Hesitantly at first, then with conviction. He rose to his feet. One by one, others joined him. The quiet applause grew into a thunderous, sustained, standing ovation. The patrons of Ethelred's billionaires and socialites were on their feet applauding a waitress. Reese remained seated frozen. The applause was like white noise in his ears. He felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. He had intended to buy a spectacle of humiliation. Instead, he had paid to witness a masterpiece of raw, untamed genius. He had treated a Stradivarius like a cheap fiddle. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a cold, hollow shame. Catalina ignored the applause. Her eyes, still locked on Reese, were filled with a cold, righteous fury. She held his gaze for a long moment, letting him see the full extent of his misjudgment. Then she turned, walked calmly to where she had left her shoes, and slipped them on. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, a gesture of such raw humanity, it made Reese flinch. Without a word to anyone, without even a glance at her furious yet dumbfounded manager, she walked straight past the maitre d' through the heavy glass doors of Ethelred's and out into the hallway, leaving a room full of applause and one utterly shattered billionaire in her wake. The receipt for $10,000 was still tucked in her apron. She hadn't earned it. She had taken it as compensation for damages. The next morning, Reese Covington woke to a world that was subtly, yet irrevocably altered. Usually, his mornings were a seamless ritual of efficiency, a 5 a.m. workout with his personal trainer, a glance at the pre-market reports from Asia, and a breakfast of black coffee and dry toast, while his personal assistant, a ruthlessly competent woman named Missoul, Davies briefed him on the day's schedule. But today he couldn't focus. The image of the waitress Catalina, he'd learned her name was from a panicked Mr. Henderson, was seared into his mind. Her dance played on a loop behind his eyes, the fury, the grace, the profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. It had been more honest and real than anything he had experienced in years. His world was one of contracts, algorithms, and calculated risks. It was a world of surfaces of polite lies and brutal truths hidden behind spreadsheets. Last night, she had ripped all of that away and shown him something elemental, and he had tried to buy it for $10,000. The thought made his stomach churn with a feeling he wasn't accustomed to self-loathing. "Sir," Ms. Davies said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "The board meeting for the Sterling acquisition is at 9. You have a preliminary call with the legal team in 20 minutes. Cancel it," Reese said, his voice flat. "Miss Ors." Davies blinked. Reese Covington did not cancel. "Sir." "You heard me. Cancel the morning, all of it." He stood up, pacing his minimalist penthouse apartment, the city sprawling beneath him. "I have a new priority. I want you to find someone for me." "Of course, Mr. Covington." "Name?" "Catalina Petrova. She was a waitress at Ethelred's. As of last night, I believe she is formally employed." "Understood. Shall I have a non-disclosure agreement drafted, a severance package?" Ms. Davies assumed he was doing damage control, paying for silence. "No," Reese said sharply. "No agreements, no money. I want to know who she is. Everything. Employment history, education, family. Everything. Use whatever resources you need. Private investigators, data, analysts, I don't care. Be discreet." "Yes, sir," she said, her professional mask hiding her surprise. For the rest of the day, Reese was a ghost in his own life. He sat in his office, the chrome and glass reflecting a man he barely recognized. He stared at a priceless Jackson Pollock on his wall, a chaotic masterpiece of drips and splatters, and for the first time, it looked like a cheap imitation of the emotion Catalina had painted in the air with her body. Meanwhile, the story had already begun to leak. Not from the patrons, their circle was too small and too concerned with appearances, but from the staff. By noon, a grainy cell phone video shot by a busboy hiding behind a service station had surfaced online. It was titled "Billionaire Dares Waitress to Dance. You Won't Believe What Happens Next." The video went viral. By mid-afternoon, it had 1 million views. By evening, 10 million. News outlets picked it up. #Waitress Dance was trending. The internet, with its insatiable appetite for David and Goliath stories, had found its new heroine. They called her the Angel of Ethelred's, the Firebird in an apron. Speculation was rampant. Was she a Juilliard dropout? a former Broadway star, a Russian ballerina who had fled her past. For Catalina, the viral fame was a terrifying, suffocating nightmare. She had gone straight from the restaurant to her brother's bedside at the hospital, sitting with him until the morning nurses arrived. When she finally got back to her cramped apartment, her roommate Jenna was waiting, her eyes wide, holding up her phone. "Kat, you need to see this," Jenna said, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Catalina watched the blurry video, her stomach twisting into a knot. She saw herself a stranger on a screen, her face contorted in a mask of pain and fury. The comments were a blur of praise and pity. They saw her as an inspiration. She just felt exposed, violated. The one thing that had been truly hers, her dance, her story, was now a piece of public consumption, just as Reese Covington had intended. "I have to disappear," Catalina said, her voice shaking. She unplugged her Wi-Fi router and turned off her phone. "He can't find me." "Who the billionaire?" Jenna asked. "Kat, what he did was monstrous, but look at this. People are offering you scholarships contracts." A scout from the American Ballet Theatre left a comment. "It's charity, Jenna. It's pity because some rich monster threw money at a poor girl. That's not how I want to go back. It's not about the art anymore. It's about the spectacle." She paced their small living room, feeling like a cornered animal. The $10,000, which she had already transferred to the hospital's billing department, felt like dirty money. It was the price of her privacy. The next 2 days were a siege. Reporters began showing up at her apartment building. She had to sneak out the back to visit Nico. At the hospital, she wore a hoodie and sunglasses, her head down, praying no one would recognize her. The newfound attention was a spotlight, but it felt less like a stage light and more like the beam of a prison watchtower. On the 3rd day, Ms. Davies walked into Reese's office and placed a slim file on his desk. "Catalina Petrova," she announced. Reese opened it, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar anxiety. The report was concise, compiled by the best investigators his money could buy. It was a life story, condensed into bullet points. Catalina Petrova, age 24. Parents Andrei and Elena Petrova. Former principal dancers with the Kyiv City Ballet. Immigrated to the US in 1999. Deceased. Motor vehicle accident. 5 years ago. Education, admitted to the Joffrey Ballet School on a full scholarship at age 16. Considered a prodigy. Dropped out at age 19. Reason for withdrawal. The same accident that killed her parents left her younger brother, Nico Petrova, age 14 at the time, with severe lifelong injuries, became his legal guardian. Sibling Nico Petrova, age 19, currently admitted to St. Damian's Hospital for Children. Diagnosis: systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis, severe and aggressive form. Multiple surgeries, requires ongoing expensive experimental biologic therapy. Employment history. A string of menial jobs for 5 years. Waitress, barista, coat, check, girl. All cash-based where possible to avoid wage garnishment from medical debt. Financials. In excess of $400,000 in medical debt. No significant assets. Reese read the report 3 times. The cold, hard facts painted a picture far more devastating than any dance. A prodigy who had sacrificed her entire future for her brother. She wasn't dancing for pride or for his dirty money. She was dancing for a life, for her brother's life. The shame he had felt before was nothing compared to the wave of revulsion that washed over him now. He hadn't just been arrogant, he had been cruel. He had taken a woman's unimaginable pain and turned it into a floor show for his own amusement. He closed the file. His usual decisiveness, his killer instinct, was gone. He didn't know what to do. Sending money would be an insult, a confirmation of her worst fears about him. An apology felt laughably inadequate, but doing nothing was impossible. "Cancel the rest of my week," he said to Miss Davies, his voice hoarse, "and get me everything there is to know about St. Damian's Hospital and this experimental therapy." He was no longer just searching for a woman. He was searching for a way to reckon with the man he had become. Finding Catalina's apartment was easy for a man with Reese's resources. Approaching it was one of the hardest things he had ever done. He swapped his tailored suit for dark jeans and a simple grey cashmere sweater, trying to appear less like a corporate raider and more like a human being. He drove himself, leaving his chauffeur and his Bentley behind, and parked his unremarkable black Audi down the street from her walk-up in Astoria, Queens. The building was old. The brick facade weathered the fire escapes, zigzagging across its face like iron scars. It was a different universe from his glass tower on Park Avenue. He stood on the sidewalk for a full 10 minutes, watching people come and go, trying to find the right words. There were none. He finally buzzed her apartment, 4B. There was no answer. He tried again. Nothing. Just as he was about to give up, the main door opened, and a young woman with bright pink hair and a nose ring came out. It was Jenna on her way to work. She recognized him instantly from the news, and her eyes widened in a mixture of fear and hostility. "You," she breathed, planting her feet firmly in the doorway. "You have a lot of nerve coming here." "I need to speak with her," Reese said, his voice quiet. "Please, it's important. So you can throw more money at her. Humiliate her some more." Jenna shot back, her voice dripping with protective venom. "She's not here, and if she was, she wouldn't wanted to see you. You turned her life into a circus. Reporters are camped out down the block. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Reese had the grace to look ashamed. "I know, I made a mistake. A terrible one. I need to apologize." "An apology isn't going to fix this," Jenna said, but his visible contrition had softened her stance slightly. She sighed a puff of frustrated air. "Look, she's not here. She's probably at the hospital, St. Damian's, with her brother. Now please just leave her alone." She pushed past him and hurried down the street. Reese stood there for a moment, the name of the hospital echoing in his head. It confirmed the file. He got back in his car, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't ambush her at a hospital. That was a sacred space. But he knew where she had to come back to. He would wait. Hours passed. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Reese sat in his car watching apartment 4B's window. He conducted a billion-dollar business from his phone, his texts and emails as sharp and decisive as ever, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about sacrifice, about a talent so bright being extinguished by circumstance. His own life had been a seamless ascent, paved with inherited wealth and sharp-edged ambition. He'd never had to sacrifice anything. Finally, just after 9 p.m., he saw her. She was walking down the street, a small, solitary figure wrapped in an oversized coat. Her hair was hidden under a beanie, her face pale and drawn in the glow of the streetlights. She moved with a weary tension, her eyes scanning the street for reporters. Reese got out of the car. She saw him immediately and froze like a deer caught in headlights. Her hand flew to her coat pocket, clutching her keys like a weapon. Every ounce of exhaustion in her body was instantly replaced by rigid hostility. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold and flat. "Miss Petrova." "Catalina." He began taking a cautious step forward. She took a step back. "I came to apologize." "You came to my home," she corrected him, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "You had me investigated. Don't insult my intelligence on top of everything else." Reese stopped. "Yes, I did. I needed to understand." "Understand what?" She shot back, her voice rising. "That people like me aren't props for your amusement. That our lives are more than a line item on a balance sheet." "Did your investigators tell you that Mr. Covington—" "They told me you were a prodigy," he said softly. "They told me what you gave up for your brother." The mention of her brother made her flinch as if he'd struck her. "You will not speak about my brother. You have no right." "I know," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. "What I did, it was inexcusable. It was arrogant and cruel, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. The world sees the video, the dance. They don't see the context. I do. And I am profoundly sorry." Catalina stared at him, her chest tight. She had expected blustering excuses, another offer of money. She had not expected this quiet, soul-deep shame. It disarmed her. But the anger was still there, a shield against the man who had laid her soul bare for the world to see. "Your apology doesn't make the reporters go away," she said, her voice brittle. "It doesn't give me back my privacy. It doesn't change the fact that people now look at me with pity." "I want to help," Reese said, stumbling back into his default mode. "The foundation I run, we could create a grant, a full scholarship to any dance conservatory you choose. We can cover all of Nico's medical expenses, all of them. Just name your price. I'll make this right." It was the worst possible thing he could have said. Catalina's face, which had softened for a moment, hardened into marble. A bitter, mirthless laugh escaped her lips. "Name my price." She repeated the words, dripping with scorn. "You still don't get it. You still think this is a transaction. You think you can throw your money at this ugly thing you created and wash it all away. My life, my brother's health, my talent. It's not for sale, Mr. Covington. It never was." She took a deep breath, her eyes glittering with unshed tears of pure fury. "The $10,000 you paid me, I gave it to the hospital. It bought Nico 2 weeks. That is the only transaction you and I will ever have. Thank you for that. And now I want you to leave. And I never, ever want to see you again." She turned on her heel and walked to her building, fumbling with her keys. She didn't look back. Reese stood on the sidewalk, the cold night air biting at his skin. He felt as though she had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. "It's not for sale." The words echoed in his mind, a final damning judgment. He had come here to fix a problem the way he always did, with money, power, and influence. And he had failed, spectacularly. He had thought the dance was her story. He was wrong. The dance was just the prologue. Her real story was one of integrity. And he had just discovered that it was the one currency he didn't possess and couldn't buy. As he walked back to his car, he knew that a simple apology and a blank check wouldn't be enough. To make this right, he would have to change the very rules of the game he thought he had mastered. Reese Covington did not become a billionaire by accepting defeat. Catalina's rejection, as cutting and absolute as it was, didn't deter him. It redefined the objective. The problem wasn't a financial one to be solved, but a moral one to be reconciled. He returned to his world of glass and steel, not with a sense of failure, but with a new singular purpose. His first call was not to his lawyers or bankers, but to Dr. Anjali Sharma, the head of pediatric rheumatology at St. Damian's Hospital. He made the call himself, bypassing Ms. Davies. He introduced himself, and after a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, he got straight to the point. "I've been made aware of your work with experimental biologic therapies for SJIA." Reese stated, his tone devoid of its usual arrogance, replaced by a focused intensity. "Specifically, for a patient named Nico Petrova." Dr. Sharma was cautious. "Patient information is confidential, Mr. Covington." "I'm not asking for information. I'm offering to provide fundings," Reese clarified. "I want to underwrite the entire research program. New equipment, more staff, full funding for clinical trials for the next 5 years. And I want to create a patient access fund to cover the costs for any family that cannot afford treatment, starting with the Petrovas. Anonymously. My name is not to be associated with it in any way. A corporate donation from a Covington Global subsidiary. That's it." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Dr. Sharma, who spent half her time fighting for grants and begging for donations, was speechless. The sum Reese was proposing was enough to change the lives of hundreds of children. "Mr. Covington, I don't know what to say. This would be transformative." "Just say you'll accept it," Reese said, "and that Nico Petrova will receive the best care on the planet, cost being no object, effective immediately." "Yes," Dr. Sharma breathed. "Of course, yes." That was the first piece, the easy piece. The second was more complex. Catalina had rejected his money because it was a handout, a transactional apology. He needed to create an opportunity, not charity. He needed to build a stage, not a gilded cage. He spent the next week in a whirlwind of activity. He leveraged his network not for financial gain, but for artistic consultation. He met with the directors of the American Ballet Theatre, the board of the Juilliard School, and choreographers whose names were legends. He wasn't buying talent. He was learning about the world that had been stolen from Catalina. He learned about the brutal toll that dance takes on the body, the short careers, the constant threat of injury that could end a dream in an instant. He learned about the thousands of talented young artists who were one medical bill, one family crisis away from giving it all up. An idea began to form, grand and audacious. It wasn't about one dancer. It was about all of them. Oliver Finch found him late one night in the office, surrounded by blueprints and proposals, not for a skyscraper, but for a different kind of structure. "I thought you'd be halfway to Tokyo for the Nakatomi deal," Oliver said, loosening his tie. "Postponed it," Reese replied, not looking up from a document. "Look at this." He slid a proposal across the vast mahogany desk. The title read, "The Phoenix Initiative." Oliver read it, his eyebrows climbing higher with each page. It was a proposal for a new foundation, endowed with a staggering $100 million of Reese's personal fortune. Its mission was twofold. First, to provide full financial and medical support for promising young dancers and performing artists whose careers were threatened by injury or personal crisis. Second, to build a state-of-the-art performance and rehabilitation center, a place where art and healing could coexist. "My God, Reese," Oliver whispered. This is incredible. What brought this on?" "You said some things aren't for sale," Reese said, finally looking up. His eyes were tired but clear, filled with a resolve Oliver hadn't seen before. "You were right, but that doesn't mean they can't be supported, nurtured. This isn't charity. It's an investment in human potential." He was building a world where someone like Catalina wouldn't have to choose between her brother's life and her own. While Reese was building his quiet revolution, Catalina was fighting a war of attrition. A few days after their encounter, she received a call from Dr. Sharma. "Catalina, I have some wonderful news," the doctor said, her voice buoyant with a joy Catalina hadn't heard in years. "A new corporate grant has just come through. It's specifically for our SJIA research and patient support. The long and short of it is this: Nico's entire treatment plan from today until he is in full remission is completely covered. All of it." Catalina sank into a chair. The phone pressed hard against her ear. She was crying silent tears of overwhelming relief rolling down her cheeks. For 5 years she had been carrying a mountain on her back, and in a single phone call it had vanished. She didn't question where it came from. In a city of immense wealth, anonymous corporate philanthropy wasn't unheard of. She accepted it as a miracle, a long overdue moment of grace from a universe that had been relentlessly cruel. The weight of financial desperation lifted, but the weight of her squandered talent remained. The viral video had died down, but its ghost lingered. She'd had offers, of course, from dance companies and choreographers, but they all felt tainted by the spectacle. They saw the story, not the artist. She ignored them all. But something had shifted in her. With Nico's future secure, a tiny, fragile seed of her own future began to germinate in the barren soil of her life. She started waking up at 5 a.m. before Jenna was awake and clearing the small space in their living room. She would stretch, feeling the familiar pull and ache in muscles long dormant. She moved through the classical positions, her body remembering the language her mind had tried to forget. It was clumsy at first. Her balance was off, her endurance gone. But the muscle memory was there, buried deep. Each day, she reclaimed a small piece of herself. One afternoon, a new player entered the game. Reese was in a meeting reviewing the shortlist for the Phoenix Initiative's executive director when his phone buzzed. It was a name from the file he'd had compiled on Catalina. Bianca Dubois. Bianca had been Catalina's chief rival at the Joffrey School. The report had described her as intensely competitive and noted several instances of professional jealousy. She was now a rising soloist with a prestigious contemporary dance company in New York. Reese, in his deep dive, had seen her name on the program for an upcoming gala at the Lincoln Center, a gala he was now a primary sponsor of. He took the call. "Mr. Covington." Bianca's voice was smooth as silk laced with ambition. "I heard about your incredible new initiative. I think it's simply visionary. I was a contemporary of Catalina Petrova at Joffrey, you know." "I'm aware," Reese said, his voice neutral. "She was always dramatic," Bianca continued, a subtle barb in her tone. "Such a shame what happened. But seeing that video, it brought it all back. I'm performing at the Lincoln Center Gala next month, the one you're sponsoring. I was hoping we could meet. Perhaps I could offer some insight for your foundation." From one artist to another. Reese felt a cold prickle of unease. He recognized her type immediately. She was an opportunist cloaked in the guise of an artist. She saw his money and influence as a ladder. But she was also a direct link to Catalina's past. "I'll be at the gala," Reese said, his voice clipped. "We can speak then." He hung up, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He was building an arc for artists like Catalina. But he knew that for every true talent, there were sharks like Bianca Dubois, circling in the water drawn by the scent of money and opportunity. And she was on a collision course with the very person he was trying to save. The Lincoln Center Fall Gala was the glittering apex of the New York Arts and Society calendar. Reese Covington, usually a reluctant attendee at such events, was now its lead sponsor. His involvement wasn't just a name on a program. The Phoenix Initiative was being officially announced that night. It was the public unveiling of his penance. He walked through the grand lobby, a man transformed. He still wore an impeccably tailored tuxedo, but the arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful gravity. He was greeted by fawning board members and socialites, but his eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a face he knew wasn't there. He had sent a personal invitation to Catalina, delivered by a professional courier. It was simple, respectful, with a handwritten note. "This is not charity. This is a stage. It's waiting for you if you ever want it. No strings attached." She hadn't replied. He hadn't expected her to. He found Oliver by the champagne bar. "Any sign?" Reese asked. Oliver shook his head. "I didn't think she'd come, Reese. It's too much too soon. But what you've built, it's magnificent. You should be proud. It's just a building and a bank account until it helps someone," Reese replied, his gaze distant. His conversation was interrupted by a voice like honey laced with ice. "Mr. Covington, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." He turned to see Bianca Dubois. She was stunning, her dancer's physique draped in a backless emerald green gown. Her smile was wet and brilliant, but it didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Ms. Dubois," Reese said, his voice coolly polite, "I'm looking forward to your performance. I do hope it lives up to the raw emotion we've all seen recently." She said, the barb aimed squarely at Catalina. "It's amazing what goes viral these days. Some of us spend decades perfecting our craft. Others just need a moment of public desperation." Reese's jaw tightened. "Talent is talent, Ms. Dubois. The public has a way of recognizing the real thing." Bianca's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She quickly recovered. "Of course. It's just... I knew Kat. I know her story. I worry she's being taken advantage of. Her emotional state is so fragile. It would be a tragedy if her little moment of fame ended up hurting her more." It was a masterful performance of feigned concern designed to plant seeds of doubt. Reese saw right through it. This woman wasn't worried about Catalina. She was terrified of her. Terrified that the raw, untrained genius of her old rival could eclipse her own polished technical skill. "I appreciate your concern," Reese said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to speak with the director." He turned and walked away, leaving Bianca fuming behind her perfect smile. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric with controlled chaos. Dancers stretched, stagehands scurried, and the air hummed with nervous energy. Bianca stood in the wings waiting for her cue. Her piece was the highlight of the second act. But her mind wasn't on her choreography. It was on Reese Covington's dismissive tone, on the whispers about the Phoenix Initiative, on the ghost of Catalina Petrova, that seemed to haunt this entire evening. She had spent 5 years clawing her way to the top, relishing the fact that her greatest rival had vanished. Now that rival was the most talked about dancer in the world, all because of one clumsy, emotional outburst in a restaurant. The injustice of it burned in her gut. Just then her phone buzzed. It was a text from a journalist she kept on a short leash, a gossip columnist at a tabloid. "Anything on the mystery Waitress?" The buzz is she's here tonight. An idea venomous and brilliant sparked in Bianca's mind. She typed a quick reply. "Source says Covington brought her, making a scene, trying to leverage her 15 minutes of fame." She's emotionally unstable. He's taking advantage. It was a lie, but a plausible one. It painted Reese as a predator and Catalina as a pathetic, unstable victim. It cheapened her talent, reducing it to a side effect of a breakdown. It was perfect. She hit send, a cruel smile gracing her lips. The story would be online before her performance was even over. Meanwhile, across town, Catalina was not at the gala. She was in a small rented dance studio in Brooklyn, the kind with scuffed floors and mirrors that had seen better days. It was the first time she had set foot in a proper studio in 5 years. The $100 for a 2-hour rental felt like an indulgence, but one her soul desperately needed. She wore old leggings and a faded t-shirt. Her body ached, but it was a good ache. The music from her phone's small speaker filled the room. It wasn't a grand symphony, but a simple melancholic piece for cello. And she danced. She wasn't dancing for an audience or for a billionaire's dare. She was dancing for herself. She was rediscovering her own lines, testing her strength, finding her balance. The movements weren't filled with the raw rage of that night at Ethelred's. They were quieter, more questioning. It was a dance of healing, of piecing together the broken parts of herself. Reese's invitation was on the bench next to her water bottle. She had read his handwritten note 100 times. A stage. It's waiting for you. A part of her was tempted, but a bigger part was terrified. She wasn't ready to step into his world, a world that included people like Bianca Dubois. She remembered Bianca's casual cruelty, her accidental trips in the hallway, the whispers she would start in the dressing room. As she finished a combination, she checked her phone for the time. A news alert popped up on her screen. The headline made her blood run cold. Billionaire sponsor Reese Covington attempts to push Waitress dancer into spotlight at Lincoln Center Gala. Sources claim Petrova is unstable and being manipulated. The article was short, vicious, and filled with anonymous quotes painting her as a pathetic mess and Reese as a manipulative puppet master. It mentioned Bianca Dubois as a concerned contemporary who worried for Catalina's well-being. Catalina sank to the floor, the phone slipping from her hand. It was happening all over again. Her story, her life was being twisted and sold by others. But this time, it was worse. They were using her to attack Reese, the one person who in his own clumsy way was trying to atone. And Bianca, her old nemesis, was pulling the strings. The old fire, the one she thought she was learning to control, roared back to life in her chest. They thought she was unstable. A victim. A pawn. She stood up, her body trembling not with weakness, but with a surge of pure adrenaline. Her quiet dance of healing was over. She grabbed her bag, her coat, and Reese's invitation. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She wasn't going to let them write her story for her. Bianca Dubois wanted a ghost. She was about to get one. Catalina Petrova was going to the gala. Catalina was in a small rented Brooklyn studio when the world intruded. In a moment of rest, wiping sweat from her brow, she glanced at her phone. A news alert lit up the screen. The headline, "A poisoned dart, billionaire sponsor, Reese Covington, attempts to push Waitress dancer into spotlight." Sources claim Petrova is unstable and being manipulated. The article was riddled with quotes from a concerned contemporary, Bianca Dubois. The words unstable and manipulated struck Catalina like a physical blow. Bianca's venom reached across the years, attempting to poison her comeback, twisting her art into a symptom of a breakdown. The quiet healing dance she had been practicing died in her heart, replaced by a clarifying, cold rage. They thought she was a pawn. A victim. She grabbed her coat and Reese's crumpled invitation. She wasn't going to hide from their lies. She was going to burn them down with the truth. She arrived at the Lincoln Center like a force of nature, her street clothes a stark rebellion against the finery of the gala. The name Catalina Petrova was all she needed to get past security and be rushed backstage, where she found Reese in the midst of a crisis meeting. He looked up, and the shock on his face was quickly replaced by awe. "I saw the article," she said, her voice devoid of fear. "It's a lie. You offered me a stage. I'm here to use it." This was not the desperate woman from his restaurant. This was a warrior. Reese looked past her to the bewildered stage manager. "The program has changed," he commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "She's on, now." In the wings, Bianca Dubois froze as the announcer's voice echoed through the theater, introducing a special performance from the Phoenix Initiative. Her name was not called. Catalina's was. The curtain rose on a bare stage. Catalina stood center, bathed in a single spotlight. The audience murmured, recognizing the figure from the viral video. But the dance she performed was not the one they expected. Gone was the raw grief and fury. In its place was breathtaking control power and precision. Every movement was a direct, elegant refutation of Bianca's slander. An arabesque held with impossible strength declared her stability. A series of flawless, powerful turns mocked the idea she could be manipulated. She was not dancing her pain. She was demonstrating her mastery. She ended not in a crumpled heap of sorrow, but in a pose of unshakable strength, chin lifted, her gaze sweeping across the theater. The silence that followed was heavy with shock before the entire building erupted in a tidal wave of applause. It was a standing ovation, not of pity, but of profound respect for a true artist. As she walked off stage, she passed Bianca, who stood ashen-faced, a ghost at a feast. Catalina didn't even look at her. Her victory was so complete, her rival was no longer relevant. She found Reese waiting in the shadows. The vast, complicated space between them, filled with money, shame, and power, had finally vanished. All that was left was two people who had seen each other's true character. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the stage." "Thank you," he replied, his voice filled with an emotion she now understood was respect. "For showing them all who you are." He didn't offer her a contract or a check. He offered her something more. The Phoenix Initiative needs an artistic director. Someone who understands what it means to fight. Someone who can build a stage for others. He held out his hand. It wasn't an offer of charity, but of partnership. She looked at his hand, then into his eyes, and saw not a billionaire, but a man who had finally learned the value of things that can't be bought. She placed her hand in his. A new dance was just beginning. The story of Catalina Petrova and Reese Covington isn't just about a dance. It's a powerful reminder that there is a story behind every face we see, a hidden talent waiting in the most unexpected places. It shows us that true strength isn't about the money in your bank account, but the fear in your soul. Catalina's journey teaches us that even when the world tries to write your story for you, you always have the power to step onto the stage and dance your own truth. It's a testament to second chances, the humbling power of empathy, and the fact that it's never too late to right a wrong. If this story of resilience and redemption moved you, please help us share it with the world. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories that challenge our perspectives. What part of Catalina's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.